Good afternoon. I'm still Greg Meemeyer, and we're still doing Image as Location, and it's fabulous to see you all here. Thank you for coming. I want to give you a brief preview. We had a fabulous morning, okay? Whoa. We had a fabulous morning, and I want to point out that it costs something like $10,000 to put a conference like this together, which means that every one of you who's here is getting a $100 art study grant, okay? And actually minus the $15 you paid for the lunch, so that's $85, okay? And why do we do that? Because it seems like a lot of money, right? Why do we do it is because we see in ourselves and each other new thoughts forming and new ideas and new exchanges. And that's very, very important because we can't get to the future without new thoughts. We have to think it out, right? And also, as Jenny Odell, an artist who exhibits at the Placemakers exhibit in the Swiss Next Gallery in San Francisco, which I highly recommend, Jenny Odell said the other day she's teaching people about things like this, about digital images. And at Stanford, most people, and like at UC Berkeley, they end up being engineers who work in companies that build these kinds of tools. And when they have this background of deep contextual thinking, they maybe will design products and things that are more contextualized in the world and less focused and separated from the world. And so we all have a responsibility to use media in a way that we thought about, in a thoughtful way. And I think that's what we get out of this, and that's why we do it, and that's why it's so important. So thank you for joining us on this. I'm going to do a quick preview of what's happening this afternoon. We're going to have a talk by wonderful artist Michael Neymark. We'll have another talk by the wonderful artist Regula Boxler. And we have a talk by Jerome Delormas, who gets an exclamation mark. I don't know why. Oh, they all do. OK, good. And then we have a coffee and tea break, which also deserves an exclamation mark. And then we have two more talks, one by Professor Kristen Wissel from UC Berkeley about the orbital location, and one by Oliver Grau from who's going to speak about virtual worlds. Oliver, where are you? Is he here? All right, he's coming right. OK, and then we have the final talk by Elizabeth Kessler. And as you see, we're going from smaller to larger scales. So we ended with the scale of the prison and with the scale of the perhaps 5 Points neighborhood and the squalid room that only was visible with the flash photograph. And we're now going to the space of dareness with Michael Neymark, and then at the very end we'll end with the scale of the universe, and we're looking very much forward to that. And after that, of course, we have a reception, so it's going to be a beautiful afternoon. With that, I will simply say that Michael Neymark is somebody who inspired me very early on as an artist with shows at SF MoMA that revealed a room that was painted white as a projector was going around projecting a film of that room onto the room, revealing what the room looked like before everything it was painted white. It was such a magical experience. And of course, these kinds of deep thoughts about how image and space relate to each other later on produced products such as Street View, things we now use routinely to imagine the world around us, image and imagine the world around us. And Michael Neymark is a very highly regarded international new media artist, and it's a real honor to have him here and right here to speak about dareness. Please welcome Michael Neymark.
Thank you. Good. OK. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Laura, for all the organizing, and thank you all for coming. A friend of mine and colleague, Rachel Strickland, a filmmaker and architect, and I used to have these arguments many years ago, actually during the early VR days, about realness in media, and they would go like this. Rachel, all things being equal, HD TV is more real than normal television. No. All things being equal, color cinema is more real than black and white. No. And she would say you can use the word verisimilitude, but do not use the word realness. It's something deeper. And what finally convinced me was just imagining that you and I can go to a movie together, and I could be brought to tears, and you might not be, or vice versa. And that the realness has to do with as much going on behind the eyeballs and ears than in front. And a friend and colleague of ours, Steve Gano, a multimedia designer, said maybe this should be called Vareness. So that's hence the title. Hey, have you heard VR's back? And of course, we all know why. Earlier this year, Facebook acquired Oculus VR that makes a VR headset for $2 billion. And I have to say that the intensity, especially in Hollywood and Silicon Valley, in my career at least, is unparalleled. I was compelled to make this slide partly because I believe this is going to happen. And I'll get to that in a bit. But it also was inspired by a video that my students did at the San Francisco Art Institute 24 years ago. Crazy, you know. And this is on YouTube. You can find the whole video. This presentation is about representation, specifically real-world representation, what I call place representation, and why it's so important right now. Spoiler, it has as much to do with hegemony and urbanization as it does with VR's recent comeback. So this presentation has two parts. Let's get started. So I used to start off talks with this, and especially with kids, and got a lot of mileage out of it. And you know, the salient point here is I don't have to ask you, how do you know I'm not a movie? Because no one in this room believes that I am a movie. And even when you see the best IMAX 3D, you're still kind of aware that it's a movie. And oddly, the ear is easier to fool than the eye. So you probably have all had the experience of turning around in a room and it's just a radio. But the eye is really hard to fool. And one way to look at it is, and this really is verisimilitude, that if we knew, I used to write papers about stuff like this, what all of the, if we liken mediation to a mixing board, and where all of the sliders are all of the elements of real space imaging, that is, all of the different parameters involved, if we knew them all, then in theory, if we turned all of the sliders up to 10, that the representation would be indistinguishable from the subject. Now, usually, in fact, always that's not the case, and we have artifacts. And artifacts is a very funny word because in computer graphics and science it's considered bad, that which you want to get rid of. But in art, it's evidence of the hand. It's good. So many of you may have seen this wonderful David Hockney retrospective at the De Young last summer. And I want to point out two obvious things here if you look. One is that temporally it's in perfect sync, and spatially it's not. And if you saw his other pieces, you'd realize how some are the other way around. So this is intentional on his part. And since Greg made a reference to this, I wanted to put this in a little bit. This is a redo from 2005 done in video, but the idea is to set up a living room and have performers move things around while filming them with a slowly rotating camera in the middle, after which you paint everything white and replace the camera with a synchronized loop projector. And it is all about artifacts in that, and that's why it's called displacements, because the people appear ghost-like and move things in and out of registration. So on the other hand, this is a screen grab now from maybe 3 years ago of the dilemma that we're having with representing place, in that there's the Street View people and there's the modeling people. And this actually was what Street View looked like briefly. And this is not what you see on the street. In fact, they finally took it down. It just doesn't look right. And the same is true with Photosynth, the cloud, point cloud they eliminated. I'd like to very, very quickly go through the history of place representation. And Oliver's a scholar on this. He's written books and whatnot. I'm just going to start with the birth of cinema. Literally, less than 5 years after the birth at Paris 1900, a huge 10-projector setup was made, never open to the public because of fire hazard. 1927, Abel Gance, 3-screen system. But it's noteworthy that in addition to making panoramas, he was equally seduced by, you know, verisimilitude be damned. You know, just 3 separate images and make it more of a montage. 1952 Cinerama, which was based very much on Abel Gantz's art piece. 3 screens, 35 millimeter, huge camera. Several years later, Circle Vision, a 9-screen, 35 millimeter. And I'm pointing out the vertical field of view because that seems to be one of the big differences with all of these. And again, another crazy camera. The Cave is relevant for several reasons. One is it's not camera-based, it's about 3D modeling. But look at the vertical field of view, very immersive. A piece of mine from quite a few years ago now, shot with a rotating projector, projected with a rotating floor. Working with UNESCO, going to various World Heritage and danger sites, and you put on 3D glasses. It's orthoscopically correct in that the field of view is the same as the cameras, and the image appears to be rotating around you, but in fact you're on a slowly rotating platform. This is with the curtain down. And if you haven't seen it, you have to trust me that the effect is exactly like the one you've all had when you're on a train in the station. The train next to you pulls out and you can swear you're moving. You really believe that this is rotating around you. Luc Corchen did a very lovely inverted southern hemisphere dome. Now, when you do something like this, you're using one fisheye lens, so the resolution problems. Artist Clifford Ross in New York made a Circle Vision-like camera and never actually displayed it, but got a New Yorker. Our colleague Jeffrey Shaw, who does similar work. Now, if you notice carefully, the camera on the right has slits in it. It's a still camera that goes around and takes about a minute to create his 3D installations. It took about a dozen years after the first Be Now Here for 3D television to come out, and then we could do something by using the same footage and spatially offsetting it. And it works, except there are time artifacts. If a dog barks, 20 seconds later it will bark on the next screen, and then it will bark on the next screen. But otherwise it works. I mean, you get a nice dose of there-ness and place representation on the cheap. Liquid Galaxy, similar to the Cave. And then the parallel track to all of this is representing moving through space as well as looking around. And this, of course, is the Google Street View car. And again, this is different from 3D models. It's a hugely different approach, and integrating the two, as I'll show in a moment, is hard. That stuff has a long, long, long history. And if you look at the upper left, the brown blob of hair with a white coat is me reaching down. And if you look at the bottom right, this was a stereoscopic system, still with film, and ended up being an installation that even today I would humbly say is faster and more responsive than Street View in terms of the intention and the interface itself by cranking it. And it's scaled properly with the optics, and of course it's 3D. Sorry, I'm moving quickly. These are some experiments that came out of the stereoscopic footage from Banff back at the lab at Interval, trying to make 3D models out of stereoscopic pairs. And on the one hand, we've made a lot of progress, and on the other hand, we still have this problem. And even as Google Earth replaces Street View and becomes photorealistic, what about motion? What about live? A solution that I cheer-led basically at USC several years ago proposes taking photos and spatially aligning them in Google Earth so that they appear magically registered. Sorry about the music. So this is one solution for, on the one hand, keeping, respecting the integrity of the imagery, your imagery, and on the other hand, having the visceral connectedness of using Google Earth in a way that's better than push pins of images on a map. And of course, you can do historical photos this way as well. Things have changed considerably over the past year because of the Oculus Facebook acquisition. And it really is like a crazy gold rush. And there are a lot of companies trying to address this on the camera front. So for example, GoPros, which you all know, they're companies making small so-called 360 heroes, large ones, stereo ones. I don't think this existed a few months ago, by the way. And professional ones, which are interesting to watch because you all will have on a pair of VR headsets in the next year or year and a half, I guarantee it. More professional ones. And this is probably the most popular coming out of Palo Alto right now. Those are microphone arrays next to the lens. It's kind of interesting. So there really is a lot of attention now about capturing and displaying there-ness in the sense of real-world imagery. And I do believe this will happen. And the reason why is because the only other way for you to have a wide-angle, ortho-stereo, high-res motion picture experience with a look around in your home is to build a flight simulator. You're not going to do that. And the prospect of people sitting, and they don't have to be in the same world, but they might be. And then, you know, again, I'm a little uncomfortable with this, but I do believe it's inevitable. And now I want to shift gears and share a story. Everybody with me? It's lunch? Good. Okay, because now we're going to change a little bit. A very long story. Another one that I was a little more of a cheerleader. I had the great privilege and honor of working with ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax through much of the 90s and help him get funded around here at Apple and Interval. And of all of the new media and culture projects, this one to me is the most ambitious and haunting. And the story begins in the 1860s in central Texas, where Alan's father, John Lomax, grew up. And it was cowboy country, like real cowboys, real cows, following the river every season. And John Lomax heard the songs, and it led him, as he grew up, to become a folklorist, a very early ethnomusicologist, with his teenage son, Alan, in the 1920s, went around and made the first field audio recordings ever. And this is verifiable because the audio recorder was given to them by Thomas Edison's widow. And they made it portable, 500 pounds worth. And it became the basis of the U.S. Library of Congress folk song archive. Alan continued for decades in other countries. People were sending him tapes. And he eventually had thousands and thousands of samples of song and later dance from around the world. He thought he heard patterns. And in the early 60s in Columbia University, put together a team to do some serious research, which they called Cantometrics, which has 37 parameters. And they made sure, when they literally came up with the parameters, that they would represent all of world music. So they include glottal stops and rasp and things like that. All songs had to be coded manually, and they could look for statistical correlations. And this is with punch cards, very non-real time. But they found some, many. And for example, the music of Georgian Russia is statistically similar to the music of Central Africa. The music of Patagonia is statistically similar to the music of Inuit Eskimo music. And of course, correlations doesn't mean causality, but what we know about evolution and migration now, it's pretty strong, romantic, provocative stuff, no? And there's more. Alan had the song archive database, the dance database. Other ethnographers had the everything you want to know about culture database. And one of the most popular was George Murdoch's ethnographic atlas. I found this online. This is the degree of manliness and womanliness in society. Kind of amusing. Things might not have changed that much. But Alan was able to, again, look for correlations in a very slow, gnarly way and found, for example, that cultures that had lateral knee movement in their song style, dance style, correlated with cultures that were early adopters of potter wheels, and cultures that had narrow heel-to-toe dances correlated with cultures that whose principal crop was planted in narrow rows like rice. And even weirder, the degree of rasp in male song style correlates with how much independence young men are trained. The high tonal blend correlates with women food production. And Alan sent a cold letter to Apple Computer it must have been around 1990, and it filtered down to me. I was at the Apple Multimedia Lab at the time and went to visit. This is 1992. And it really was clear as a bell to him. He believes that there's a unifying theory of culture, and that culture is as resilient as genes. And I guess I have enough time. So, for example, if you take an entire population, enslave them, put them on ships, take them across the ocean, make them work, eat different food, wear different clothes, their music survives. And that's why we have the blues. At Interval in, I think this is the late 90s, we produced Alan's first demo of what he called the Global Jukebox. And this is, again, on YouTube. It's very HyperCard, very Laserdisc. Alan died in 2002. His daughter, Anna Lomax Wood, is now running the show. Another 9 years pass, and then some news. In 2011, a book came out on Alan's life, and he really, as it says, did inspire musicians. He did a radio show on the BBC in, I think, the early 50s. He's generally credited as the discoverer of Leadbelly, Huddie Ledbetter, Jelly Roll Morton, Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan. He called Bobby, crashed in his Greenwich Village apartment when he first got there. Alan worked at the Library of Congress with Pete Seeger's parents, so he watched Pete grow up. And through the popular show on BBC, it was watched by Lennon, McCartney, Townsend, Clapton, and the Rolling Stones got their name from a blues song that they heard on Alan's show. A year later, now we're up to 2012, for the first time, the phrase global jukebox sort of enters, mass media vernacular, and they're putting the stuff online, but not in this highly correlated way, but it is some great exposure. A little bit after that, Gideon, the guy in the video, and I met with Anna, and little has changed since the HyperCard Laserdisc thing. They're struggling financially. I gotta say, it's, to me, one of the coolest projects ever, and if you think Pandora, which is also correlating music with metadata, but then correlate that with geography, with dots, with points on a map. Music and culture correlated with points on a map. Everybody has roots. There's a huge ecological message here. And urbanization, as people move to cities, this message is getting lost. So again, to me, this is a hugely interesting and important project. Also, at the end of last year, just to try to raise some funds, their friend Martin Scorsese did a little thing. I still have time. So around when we were doing the video and Alan was alive, I was at the Royal College of Art, Interval as a supporter, and just by chance, there was an art show opening on the main gallery floor, and I got there early, and it was a graphic artist who did a lot of stuff with Mick Jagger. And I walked in, and almost no one was there, but Mick was there, and like almost this far away. And I thought to myself, this is my shot. I can, do you remember Alan Lomax? And I know that he would say yes, and say, this project needs funding. And in that, I don't know, 1.5 seconds that I waited to approach Mick Jagger was over. He was approached by too many other people. So you kind of wonder about things. The work is continuing, but on a modest budget, and it is definitely getting more sophisticated. Literally last July, they successfully achieved a modest but successful Kickstarter campaign. Again, this is small potatoes for what this project is. And here's an excerpt on the Global Jukebox at the end of the 2011 book, which credits Alan heavily for metadata, for folksonomy. And the author gave me the final non-Alan quote in the book. You can read it yourself. Alan's biggest fear, in a word, was hegemony. And as people moved to cities, and young people would rather listen to Gaga, watch MTV, there's kind of a funny question about not only us pushing the stuff on them, but how do you convince teenagers from other cultures that their culture has value to us, and that in the end, and Alan strongly believed this and convinced me, the loss will be ours. So I believe that this is a pretty good use for immersive media, even if it does look like this, and if it helps us appreciate a sense of actual places and theirness, good. My personal preference is for public space immersion. But either way, to me, all of the stuff is good. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. You now get the honor of answering a few questions. This was a beautiful tour through some of the really core concepts of new media, and you've been there to move those along. So thanks for sharing all that with us.
Pleasure.
And let's see, are there any questions in the audience? Any microphones? Everybody's still thinking. That happens sometimes.
They're awake.
Could I, as microphone bearer, ask you a question?
Sure.
Yes, that's fine.
So I'm sure you're familiar with Oliver Wendell Holmes' description of the stereoscope and that sort of famous phrase he has where he says, "Give me a few images of a thing and then tear it down or burn it up.
Yeah.
I don't need the original anymore." I wonder how much you think these representations can substitute or replace. Where does there-ness, that sense of being there, start to replace this-ness in the sense of materiality?
Thank you. That's a very good question. As a survivor of VR 1.0, the main reason it didn't survive is the technology was not economically scalable. But the hype sure as hell didn't help. And again, this is why this is a little sort of rant against the word realness and using it all the time. Most of my colleagues that are practitioners in VR are enthusiasts of VR, and I'm not one of them. I'm cautiously enthusiastic, and the way that I would characterize it, and every time I hear somebody say we're making the holodeck, I want to kill them. Remember, the audiences ducked at the oncoming train of the Lumiere brothers film that we don't today. So I see it more as a cat and mouse game. And that we're going to put on Oculus VR and Samsung and other sort of headsets over the next couple of years and be wowed, and we'll acclimate in a bit. So I'm not worried about replacement, and I think it's a much more, if I may say, realistic or practical approach of recognizing that even if you get the resolution right, and the Oculus people are talking about, they'll give you, pixels per degree and stuff like that, but the rest of your body isn't moving. I mean, there's still anomalies, so it's never really going to be entirely like being there. And I think we would be better off if we recognize that.
It is a strong tension because the people in Lomax's world are so active. And the people in Lomax's world are so active, and the people behind the Oculus are also active, but they're active in a way that has been described as the interpassivity. Have you come across that term?
Yeah.
This sort of staged activity where you think you're active, but you're really just choosing from a set of predetermined options.
They also drink in different bars. And that's, if there's one message I have for students these days is to spread out and try to develop cultural translation skills. I would be thrilled if the Google people and the Oculus people and the Facebook people took the effort, and vice versa, it works in both directions, to appreciate things like real-world imagery and the people behind them.
Right. Okay, on that note of documentation and looking at the real world, we're going to transition.